Thanks, Samantha. Okay, so I hope everybody can see my screen.
Yep, we can see you there.
Okay, so welcome to another webinar session where we hopefully can transfer some more knowledge that is pertinent to your journey into wellness and weight management. My voice is going a little bit, so if it strains through the talk, just please let me know. I can always repeat a few things. I might pause a little bit to take a sip from time to time as well. So this talk will be about 30 minutes or so, and hopefully you'll find it informative. So what is the best diet? That's always one of the things that a lot of people ask us. What style should I be eating and whatnot? And obviously, there's lots of eating styles. And let's differentiate between eating styles and clinics who do certain things. For example, you have Jenny Craig and stuff like that, or Weight Watchers. But then we have also the styles of eating. For example, you have plant-based eating, you have ketogenic style eating, you have low-carb style eating. And so there is a slight distinction between styles and certain clinics, but predominantly we're going to focus on more styles of eating, and a lot of clinics might overlap multiple eating styles. And if you are part of our program, you might know that we don't endorse any specific eating style. We typically tailor it to your medical profile. If you're a diabetic, if you have cardiovascular disease, etc., that kind of stuff, and we eat accordingly. But for the most part, a lot of people say, well, how do I lose the most weight? What kind of style should I be eating? Hopefully by the end of the seminar that you'll at least have an impression of what may be better than others. And as you might think that there may be no best diet, but just more of a best individual diet, perhaps. So what are our objectives for today? We're talking about food in general. Obviously, that's an integral part of nutrition and dieting. We're going to talk about hedonism. Basic hedonism is the natural pleasure seeking that we have. That's about the purest sense, in this purest sense. And I kind of think about the mechanism of that. And for example, it's the liking and the wanting. The liking basically is our basic pleasure-seeking principle or behavior, and our wanting is more our cognitive behavioral component, where there's a bit of motivation and drive to go after certain food or foods that we like. We talk about food addiction. Just kind of describe what food addiction is. It's not a true diagnosis, but it is important to recognize that there is similarities between substance abuse in addicts, and as well as in people who are food addicts as well. And then obviously we're going to get to the core of it. What is the best diet or eating style? We talk a little bit about longevity, because nutrition plays a big role in terms of longevity, warding off diseases, chronic diseases. And obviously, diet with exercise as well. There is some importance of that. And so, as not one thing that you do will maximize your weight loss, but it's also a multitude of things you do that will optimize your overall health. So what does food mean to you? And this is very individualized, obviously. And we definitely build a relationship with food very early on, probably from infancy, from the way the mother, our mother kind of tends to us, whether they tend to us when we start to cry or let us kind of cry a little more. And there's some psychological data for that too as well. But through our clinics, we see people have lots of different relationships with food. And so obviously sometimes we eat food out of comfort. We use food in terms of enjoyment and celebration, in terms of food, in terms of multiple traditions in our cultures as well. And so for food, it plays lots of roles for all of us, and obviously in terms of different importance as well. But one way to think about food that may be practical is kind of the fun or a function of it. And the fun part is obviously, the celebratory part that we do. birthday parties, and weddings, etc., all that kind of stuff. And obviously food is an integral part of gatherings. It's a social magnet for a lot of us. But also we have to think about food as a function. I think a lot of times we lose this. Sometimes we go for foods that are more tasty, but maybe we know that's not as nutritious for us as well. And so we have to find that balance of kind of with respect to food, of whether it's fun we do for enjoyment, like for example, it's an indulgence, versus its function as to make us live longer, to ward off diseases and whatnot. And a lot of times, I say to my patients, you need to have a good balance of maybe 30 to 70%, 30% fun, or 20% fun, and 80% or 70% in terms of function. But also the quality, quantity is very important in terms of food. Obviously, the quality is really tough to figure out, and because of the way foods are made, processed, and packaged, we're getting food from overseas and down south. We have fruit all year long of different varieties as well. And so, for example, some of the oranges that come from Florida or even South America, they are actually ripened along the way, and so you lose a bit of nutrients, right? And so the quality of food becomes important. And so back in the 50s and 40s, our parents or grandparents, their food was way more nutritious. There was actually more than 30% more nutritious than our food today in terms of nutrient within the food that we're eating. And obviously the quantity of food plays a big role as well. And also our macronutrients, the composition of, proteins, carbohydrates, and fat plays a role. Unfortunately, a lot of our foods nowadays are significantly processed, highly refined, ultra processed, and we have a lot of marketing around food as well. And there's a science actually around food. The way it tastes, the salt, the crunch, the amount of fat. So the composition of the food becomes very, very important. And just a fun fact, McDonald's, their next kind of Big Mac sauce is actually developed in actually Toronto. It was a chef in Toronto, and took him, I believe, it's over a year to develop the next Big Mac sauce, right? And so you can imagine how much money these companies put into to make the food taste good, so that we come back to it too as well. So, and so the composition of food becomes very important. And I touched upon this last time with respect to the hormonal regulation of appetite. And so we know that ghrelin is our hunger hormone, and leptin is our satiety or fullness hormone, and this plays in the wanting of food too as well. So if you're really hungry, you go too long without food, you tend to overeat, you eat a lot faster, you tend to want more of the refined, high carbohydrate, high fat food as well, right? So basically not all food are equal. We think about kind of ultra processed food, refined foods, and whole foods. And in our clinic, we have 3 guiding principles, minimize processed, packaged, and refined food. And if you're able to do that, for the most part, your food is going to be really good too as well. Obesogenic chemicals, and this is a very unregulated industry, food. It's really, really bad, to be honest with you. The food industry does not have to label all the chemicals. It has and there's lots of different regulations. So, for example, if it meets a certain weight, then they have to actually put it on. But because there's lots of preservatives, we don't know what a lot of these chemicals do to us, but a lot of them are obesogenic in general too as well. And also, with respect to food, certain foods we want more, right? And so typically it's more our high carbohydrate, more of the sweeter foods and the fatter foods that we actually want. And so when it comes to food, there's a certain wanting and liking. And so is there a way for us to actually explain from a neuroscience perspective, how we regulate the wanting and the liking of food. And so for this, we're going to dive into a little more basic science, just to give you an overview, the complexity, just like, in terms of appetite, energy, metabolism regulation with some of the hormones we talked about in our last webinar. This kind of, in a sense, will also, work in tandem with the appetite hormones as well. So none of these obviously work in silos. They do influence one another. So when we talk about the basic hedonic drives for pleasure, and so one of the ways to do that is to determine, well, what's more of a universal reaction of mammals in general. And so if we look at the studies that are done, what they've done is that they try to look for a behavior elicited by a stimulus, right? And so usually that stimulus is in form of sugar, right? And most mammals like sweet things. And so what they've done is, in the different mammals, that they give kind of sugar liquid, and they see the reaction. And over the different mammals, from like, infants, obviously, who have less cognitive control, it's more, a reflexive behavioral, to chimpanzees, apes, gorillas, to even actually to even actually mice and rats. The general behavioral response when they're exposed to a positive stimulus like sugar, the liking kind of behavior, are actually very similar. And so basically they stick out their tongue, they're kind of they elicit more of a smile expression to that. Now, that sticking out the tongue is actually fairly universal between all the mammals, but the duration that these animals stick out the tongue, that how fast that happens, or how long it prolongs for, is proportionate to their size. And so for obviously a mouse or a rat, it's very brief, right? And so for larger animals, it'll be a more obvious sign too as well. And so that's kind of one of the ways we can think about our desires. So in general, we basically have a natural tendency to like certain things and look for kind of the pleasure in things. The opposite is true too as well. There are things that we don't like, so usually it's bitterness, and so it also elicits a very universal response with respect to all the mammals as well. Now, one question we may ask ourselves is, like, where in the brain does this occur? Does it occur in a certain location, or does this occur in all parts of the brain in general? And so in order to answer that, we have to figure out, well, what are some of the neurotransmitter? And that's the way the neurons in our brain communicates, right? And so one of the ways this liking kind of response is interpreted in the brain is through a neurotransmitter through the opioid system. So opioids basically is the narcotics that we use in the hospitals, or the abuse, substance abuse that people use, like fentanyl and stuff like that. And so when these neurotransmitters release the opiates like neurotransmitters, they elicit a like response. And so that's the relationship between the neurotransmitter and our general liking response. Now, what they found was that over the entire brain, throughout, there are opioid receptors. And so if we look at our brain, it's made of really three components: the forebrain, which is the large part that has these kind of hills and valleys; the midbrain; and the hindbrain. Basically, there's a reptilian part of the brain. And so our forebrain is kind of the last to develop in terms of evolution, and that's our cognitive control of things and cognition, and that kind of allows us to think more and have thoughts and influence our behavior, onto what we do. And so if it's kind of throughout the brain, we know that kind of integrates into our own cognition. But there is a center of the brain where, if we actually stimulate it, all we get is a liking response without any higher cortical input. And so that area is actually in what we call the ventral pallidum here. And so we actually have a core area in the brain that is just pure liking. However, these opioid receptors that stimulates the liking of a certain stimulus is throughout the brain. And so because it's throughout the brain, there is a overlap of our cognition that influences these stimulus. So you might, for example, if you like sweet stuff, you might like chocolate, but not like caramel, right? And so you impose your own cognition and experiences into the stimulus as well. And we know that the basic liking stimulus, the hedonic liking, is somewhat very primitive, because in the mice studies where they actually separate the forebrain from the brainstem, these mice still elicit the same response. And so it is a very primitive response, and probably represents a survival mechanism, right? So just to summarize, kind of our wanting and liking of food. So the liking is basically the basic stimulus for food in general, of any seeking pleasure of stimulus. And then in terms of the wanting, that's more of a behavioral response on top of this. And so in essence, these two actually work in tandem, right? They don't work in silos, because the opioid receptors are kind of over the entire brain. And that's kind of where we stimulate in terms of the liking of food in general. Let's talk about food addiction. Now, as I mentioned earlier, food addiction is not a diagnosis based on the DSM-5, which kind of is the textbook for making mental health diagnosis, but it is recognized as a condition, and the prevalence is quite high. So up to, in some literature, up to 20% of individuals have addiction to food. And their effects to the brain are very similar to individuals who abuse illicit substances. And so really it works along the dopamine pathway. And so they get a stimulus that releases dopamine, and that's the kind of that wanting and the liking of the effect, and they go out and seek it afterwards as well, right? And typically these foods are very palatable foods, often high in sugar, high in fat, and salt as well, right? And often these individuals will eat beyond their satiety cues, I mean, eat beyond their fullness, right? And they also can have some mental cognitive component to it, meaning that they often obsess on what to eat, when to eat it, and how to obtain it. Now, it becomes more of addiction when it starts to affect other aspects of their life, such as the physical effects of the eat beyond the means and they gain significant amount of weight, and there's a physical health component. And also if they, for example, go out of their way to do things to seek food, so the social effects of things, or sometimes they avoid food because they know that they overeat, and there's an anxiety around it too as well. So those are some of the psychological, physical, and social effects of food addiction. There are three kind of meal characteristics that often lead to overconsumption. Typically with food addiction, typically it's the energy of the meal itself, the energy density, and how palatable the food is, the better taste, obviously, and how quickly typically the meals are eaten as well. And this is different from, some of the DSM-5 diagnosis of eating disorders. And so, for example, anorexia nervosa, binge eating, and bulimia. With anorexia nervosa, these individuals often are very thin. Usually BMI of less than 18, 16 and whatnot. And these individuals avoid food. And binge eating, and to a degree, we all of us probably do a bit of binge eating, whether in parties or, when we're by ourselves sometimes. Basically you're just eating a large amount of food or calories in a short time span. And bulimia is a little different from binge eating, in which these individuals engage in behaviors that usually through guilt, to kind of purge, or excessive exercise to compensate for the excess amount of calories. So food addiction is a real thing, and basically the way it affects the brain, similar to drug addicts in general, and they work through the dopamine pathway. And this is different from what I mentioned earlier, with kind of our hedonistic desire to seek pleasure in the kind of the liking stimulus. That's more of an opiate pathway versus the dopamine pathway. So what are the 18 most addictive food? This was actually based on a Harvard study. The higher the number, the more addictive it is. And so pizza stands at number 1, chocolate number 2, chips, cookies, ice cream, French fries, cheeseburgers, sodas, cake. As you can imagine, the top 9 are all like high carb, high fat, high in sugar foods, right? And then you go down, you get cheese, bacon, fried chicken, popcorn, rolls, which are basically buns, breakfast cereal, gummy candy, steak, and muffins, right? So the only protein really there, good protein, is steak. So what about the least addictive foods? As you can imagine, a lot of these are actually fruits and vegetables. Number 1 was cucumbers, carrots, beans, apples, brown rice, broccoli, bananas, salmon, corn. As you go down to other ones, they get to be a little more sweet, so people like them a little more. So strawberries, granola bar, water's in there too as well, crackers, pretzels, chicken breasts, eggs, and nuts. Oops, sorry about that. So let's move on to different eating styles. And so I'm just going to briefly explain some of the eating styles. A lot of you guys know a lot of these styles. And so I'm not going to go into too much detail. Very common nowadays, we have the ketogenic diet. And so for those that don't know, the ketogenic diet was initially developed in the 50s or some of that to treat refractory epilepsy. And so what they found was that individuals have really high ketones. These individuals had less seizures. And so the true definition back then, was actually an 80% fat diet, right? And so the ketones are extremely high. And so when you ever measure your blood ketones, the upper limits of normal is usually 0.6 to 0.8. These individuals in the epilepsy studies were actually in the 20s and high teens and whatnot. Now, there are some therapeutic effects of high ketones. And so, some think that it can improve or ward off dementia, Alzheimer's, and there's some potentially anti-carcinogenic effects as well, because a lot of cancers actually use glucose as their source of energy. Similar to the ketogenic, but more flexible, is the low carbohydrates. So this is more of what a lot of individuals do. They cut off the bread, cut off the rice a little bit. And typically the way we define it is from carbohydrates, the calories that come from there are less than 45%. Previously, before the Canadian guidelines changed, it used to be about 60-65%, right? So almost 2/3, so which is quite a lot. And so the guidelines have changed for the better, for sure. Low-fat diets, there was a big craze, obviously, in the 80s and early 90s and even early 2000s about low-fat diets too as well. And typically less than 20% of your calories come from fat, and that's typically considered a low fat. Now, some people do combine some of these eating styles, so low carb, low fat. Extremely hard to do, obviously, but can be done. And so usually you are eating less food overall, because a lot of plant-based food tends to have a little bit more carbohydrates, and in order to reduce some of your fat, you have to reduce a lot of meat eating as well. Low glycemic food, you might not have heard of this. Basic is based on instant spike of food, and so basically you have the glycemic index. and this is the insulin index basically. And so certain foods will cause a sugar rise. As a result, our insulin rises accordingly to lower sugar. And so basically what you're doing is you're eating foods that don't increase insulin too much. And so overall, your blood sugar will be better too as well. And typically these foods are less refined and non-processed food, more natural whole foods as well. The Mediterranean eating style or diet, a lot of us know that. And obviously there's been good data for this. It probably has the most data for all the eating styles, right? And it's probably one of the most balanced eating styles. So you're focusing on whole foods, vegetables, fruits with olive oils and fish and nuts and seeds too as well. So fish is a big component in the Mediterranean style, obviously, because where it came from, fish it was a good source of protein for them, right? Other ones here we have more of a balanced mixed style. So these basically just conform to the current guidelines. For example, our Canadian food group guidelines. In there also is the DASH diet. Basically, it's the diet approach to stop hypertension. It's a very popular diet actually, and basically it's very similar to the Mediterranean in the sense that it's based on one of the hallmarks is obviously the sodium content, typically based on the individual's sex and age and whatnot. The amount of sodium is reduced. Foods are typically non-processed, non-refined, non-packaged foods as well. Paleolithic foods, basically trying to eat as if back in the caveman days, and so you're eating more of a lean meat, plant-based, non-processed food. As you can imagine, if you take away the processing of food, it's going to be better regardless. And so there's obviously evidence for this type of eating style. Plant-based food or vegan style of eating. Obviously, this is a very common in certain cultures as well, particularly Indian cultures. They do a lot of plant-based eating. When you do eat plant-based, you tend to have a higher carbohydrate. And so your a combination of macronutrients does play a role. For example, diabetes is really high. The prevalence of diabetes is really high in the Indian population. And the reason for that is that because a lot of them are plant-based and you would think plant-based is healthy for you, but what you put with it is important. So you're eating plant-based with a lot of high fat foods and a little bit of sugar, obviously the body is not going to like that. It's going to process it's really calorie dense, and it's going to process things differently too as well. So one of the important eating styles or diet I want to mention is called the Ornish diet. You might have read some of his book. He's is Dr. Ornish, and the way he got started was that he had a grandmother who was ill with congestive heart failure, and he took it upon himself to learn how to treat it naturally because she went through the medical system and it didn't really work out. And so he went more of a plant-based eating style, and so obviously she got better. But one of the interesting about his diet is that there is a bit of evidence, although the studies are extremely small, like I think it was only 5 individuals, but they did prove that to a degree, plant eating style was able to demonstrate a degree of reduction in coronary disease, right? And so because of that kind of study, he was actually very famous, and he was one of the chief, I think he was one of the chief health officers for the Clinton administration as well. There's other ones such as gluten-free diets, raw, and also just a popular culture like South Beach diet, etc., low salt diet too as well. So lots of eating styles, and that's why it's hard to say that perhaps one is the best. But let's take a look at some data to see perhaps maybe some are better than others at certain parts. And so this is a comparison of a dietary macronutrient patterns of 14 popular dietary programs for weight and cardiovascular risk reduction in adults. And so this is what we call a systemic review and a network meta-analysis. Basically, it's a fancy word for collecting a bunch of studies to compile the data versus just one study who may have less test subjects per se. And you can see here, the dots represent, the bigger the dot, the more the studies, right? And so how they connect with each other. And so moderate macronutrient eating, low carbohydrate eating, the usual diet. Usually diet often is the comparison. We have the low fat diet and, you know, dietary advice. So if you go into a program, that's dietary advice. And you look at on the left, sorry, the right-hand side, here are the 14 eating styles and stuff like that. So we have the Paleolithic, Ornish, Mediterranean, low fat. Jenny Craig is in here. Dietary advice, Dash Diet, Biggest Loser, you know, so those individuals in that program. The Atkins style is very popular too as well, and that's more of a ketogenic style, low carbohydrate flavor to it. The eating zones, we'll talk more about blue zone eating. Weight Watchers in here, volumetrics, basically just measuring out. South Beach, Slimming World. These are other kind of clinics that are popular in the United States as well. So, so they looked at all these, and let's kind of look at some of the data that they find, see where we end up here. So basic, there was 121 studies that looked at. Overall, there were 22,000 roughly participants in the studies, and the average age was 50, you know, 69% of women, and the average length of the intervention was about 26 weeks, right? So about half a year. And here we look at just a quick summary of some of the data here. So focus on this weight loss per kilogram. So here's on the left-hand side, we have the eating style, so dietary advice, modified macronutrients, low fat, and low carbohydrates. And so the zero it tells you kind of where the middle mark is, where there's no difference. So if anything, if you are on the right-hand side, you're doing better. So on the right-hand side of this line, you're doing better. And so here we have the different colors in terms of the grade score for the quality of the studies itself. So ignore that. But you can see here that if you are eating a modified macronutrient, low fat, low carbohydrate, you'll tend to lose some weight in general. So these are positive studies for that, right? And we'll look at kind of lowering of blood pressure too as well. Obviously, these compared to the normal dietary advice shows that we do low blood pressure. These are the studies that kind of are involved in that. But let's kind of dive in a little deeper to look at kind of certain other variables here. So we have on the left-hand side here, guys, the y-axis, and these are our different programs or eating styles here. Here we have some variables we're looking at. So weight loss in general, we have a drop in systolic blood pressure. That's your upper number. Your diastolic blood pressure, that's your lower number. Your LDL, which is your bad cholesterol. Your HDL, which is your good cholesterol. And your C-reactive protein, which is an inflammatory marker. And the reason why they put that in there is the theory nowadays that we think about coronary artery disease starts more with inflammation, not just a high fat clogging of arteries. That's not true anymore. It starts with breakage of the what we call the endothelium of the coronary artery vessels, basically the inner lining. So it creates maybe a little crack, and then what happens is the body starts to heal itself. It creates a little kind of sticky glue with platelets and clotting factors, and then that's how we start the cascade of coronary artery disease, right? And so we do actually measure that in our clinics as well. And so we try to reduce the inflammation in general. Typically, inflammation is bad for the body, although there are some inflammation that is good for the body too as well. So we look at here. So let's look at the colors first. So the colors represent the more the green, the brighter the green, that has one of the most effect, and then obviously the lower the green, you have least effect. And then as you go down to the yellows, it's just inferior. And you can see maybe the worst diet is the lightest color here. And so I'm just going to focus on the dark green so that we can say, well, what's the best for certain parameters or variables we're looking at. So you look here. So the Atkins style, Jenny Craig here, right? So that's probably calorie counting perhaps as well. And so it does work, you know, like I said, a lot of these weight management clinics do work. It's just, can you sustain it? That's the biggest thing. So if you're counting calories or using point systems, you might not do it forever, right? As well. So here, even some of the lighter greens are not as good, but effective in terms of weight loss in general as well. So basically, the zone, the dash, the Mediterranean too as well. What about blood pressure lowering, the Paleolithic diet? And so that's looking at the eating kind of like your caveman days, so pure foods, no preservatives, no additives, low salts. You're not seasoning a lot of things, right? So you're eating lots of fruits and vegetables as well. And then diastolic blood pressure here again, it's kind of this kind of a low carbohydrate eating style. As you can see here, this is a low carbohydrate. Atkins is a low carbohydrate eating style. Paleolithic tends to be a low carbohydrate eating style. So you're not really eating a lot of grains. And so it tends to be lowering your blood pressure pretty good too as well. What about LDL? Lowering LDL. And so the Mediterranean style looks like to be the best for reducing your bad cholesterol. And the reason for this is the polyunsaturated fats that we eat, so the olive oils that we're eating, right? They can lower that. They're eating more fishes as well, the omega-3s and 6s that can improve the LDL profile. And so the HDL here, Jenny Craig and Atkins style, and this green here may be amongst the most effective. Not really sure. So basically, not a lot of data with respect to the HDL, but we have other variables, so weight loss, blood pressure, to bad cholesterol. We have pretty good evidence for that. And when you do a low carb eating style, it's very hard to predict how the LDL and HDL goes, but you can actually predict the triglycerides. I'm surprised triglycerides are not on here. And so if you eat low carbohydrates, your triglycerides actually will drop pretty quickly. Now, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about eating for longevity. And so the best way to learn how to eat for longevity is just to study people who live a very long time. And there are areas around the world that actually have the most centenarians per capita, I mean, people who live over 100. So these are the 5 places here in the world. So one is Sardinia, Italy, Icaria in Greece, Okinawa in Japan, Nicaragua in Costa Rica, and La Moda Linda in California. So that's kind of, these are the places. And so, what are the common features? What are they eating? So a lot of them, first of all, they eat whole food, eat real food, fresh, made that day type of food. There's usually no additives. One of the things that we see then is they eat a lot of plant-based food. So you're eating about 90%, 95% to plant-based, some of them 100% plant-based too as well. They eat very minimal meat, not fish, but just meat in general. Okay. And so so that's a common feature for them. They eat a lot of nuts as well as for snacks. They limit their eggs as well to 2-3 times per week. They eat a lot of beans as well, lentils and beans as well, and they minimize the amount of sugar intake and also dairy as well. So those are the common features. Hydration, they're drinking about 7 to 8 glasses of water per day, and they're choosing kind of whole wheat and sourdough bread over white flour bread. So those are kind of their features of their food components. But there are obviously other things in general that also promote longevity. And so, as I mentioned already, some of the food products, but you look at other aspects that are important in terms of longevity. So family, non-smoking, obviously we talked about plant-based heavy diet, constant moderate physical activity, social engagements, and eating a lot of legumes as well. So this Venn diagram, this is called a Venn diagram. So the center where all the circles overlap tells us that this is the commonality between all the 3 all the 3 areas where longevity occurs. So, family, non-smoking, plant heavy eating style, constant moderate activities, social engagement, legumes are common to all these three individuals, right? So that's kind of some things to emulate if you want to live longer. So basically eating less refined, processed, and packaged food, and then eating more of a plant-based food, good activity, good family, good social engagements will allow you to live a lot longer. Now, I want to bust a large myth that you can't build muscle without eating meat. And so a lot of times, and this comes from, probably the pumping iron days of Arnold Schwarzenegger, where these guys are eating tons and tons of protein. But one of the crazy paradox is that, we look at cows, right? And bulls even, how much muscle they have, and all they eat actually is plant-based. And so, just thinking about that makes kind of that that eating meat will build muscle, or leads to build muscle the fastest is not actually not true. So you can actually build lots of muscles without protein, but you're getting without meat, sorry, but you are getting protein from different sources, and that's important thing to do is to distinguish is that you are getting protein, but it's from different sources. And the other thing is that you don't need as much protein as people think you do. So this is actually Terry Washington. He's actually, Tory Washington. He is a professional bodybuilder, and he's a pure plant-based bodybuilder. And so obviously he's got great muscles, and so you can really build a lot of muscles. And what are some of the key components if you're going to be plant-based in terms of building muscle? And so to maintain good muscle, you need about 0.8 grams per kilogram to maintain good muscle health. If you want to grow muscle, you do need a little more protein. So you're bumping up to 1.2 to 2 milligrams as well. Eating plant-based, what are some of the benefits? Increased energy, increased blood flow. And so they've actually studied the amount of blood flow after a meal of regular diet with protein and meat versus a regular plant-based diet too as well. And so they've actually demonstrated that there is increased blood flow. In meat in general, there actually is some pro-inflammatory proteins in it, and that's why eating plant-based will reduce inflammation in general. And also it increases muscle efficiency. There's lots of actually athletes who are plant-based eaters. And so one of the most famous one is Carl Lewis. Caitlyn Jenner is also a plant-based individuals. In the London Olympics, actually, the oldest ever gold medalist cyclist is a plant-based eater, and she was in her, I want to say late 30s or early 40s, and I want to say in the 40s, and so that's really unheard of. And so plant-based does have its benefits too as well. A lot of us who want to lose weight, we end up going to the gym. Obviously, that's very important. But how does nutrition plus exercise affect our weight loss? As you can probably infer that that obviously having two of these worlds are significantly better. And so if you combine your diet with combine your exercise with some good eating habits, you tend to have a 20% more greater weight loss. And you also tend to sustain the weight loss longer after a year. So 20% greater sustaining in terms of the weight loss. But in general, most people do regain some weight over a year. And so that's why it's not just kind of what you do, it's also your mindset, top-down approach. You really have to change your standards overall to have a long-lasting weight loss. When you exercise, you improve your VO2 max, basically how much work you can produce in amount of time with an exercise component. Patients who exercise improve in terms of their physical performance score, the ability to do things, for example, their gait, their walking, those type of activities. What we do know that exercise alone does not really make you lose weight. So a lot of times the people who exercise, their weight stays the same. They feel better, everything, if kind of improves, but their weight number does not change. And so, but what they obviously don't have access to is kind of the body composition. So when you do exercise and your weight doesn't change, and let's say your diet's the same, there are positive changes that are going on. And typically what it is you're building muscle, which is counterbalance your weight loss. And so if you actually do a body composition scan, what you see is that there is more fat loss with exercise than just basically diet alone, right? Diet, in terms of when you diet versus exercise, there's no really difference in terms of weight loss in general. But when we compare diet with diet and exercise versus diet alone, the combination is obviously superior for weight loss in general. And also, if you do diet and exercise versus just exercise alone, again, it's superior to exercise alone in terms for weight loss. So obviously, you want to exercise as you are on your journey for weight management, but sometimes that's very difficult to do. If you have lots of aches and pains as well, it's it'd be really detrimental to your joints if you're going to go for a jog or going for a super long walk, right? And so you definitely need to be active, but don't need to go crazy in terms of exercise. But so typically in the beginning, your nutrition is going to be more important. You want to be active as you're losing in the beginning part of losing weight. And as you start to plateau, this is where exercise comes in and becomes more important overall. So in summary, diet versus lifestyle. And, obviously we want you to have more of a lifestyle. And so you're going to be eating lots of eating styles. There's no one best eating styles. You can see different eating styles will have different improvements in terms of different variables in terms of weight loss, cholesterol, etc. Diet and exercise is the combination is the best for overall weight loss and also maintenance of weight loss. If we want to live long, there is some common features with respect to eating styles, obviously not just eating style, but also lifestyle as well as in terms of like our relationships or our physical activity. And don't worry about building muscle if you are eating more of a plant-based eating style. Obviously, there's lots of data and lots of individual athletes who are actually plant-based as well. So that kind of ends my discussion. It is quite lengthy. And so I'll open up the floor for question and answers. And also our next session is exercise without movement.
Thank you very much there, Dr. Lee. That was lovely to see. Now, I appreciate those who had the opportunity to enter some of the questions about the polls I sent through about your current diet and what you've tried over the past. I'm just going to send out another one here now, if you all don't mind just popping on and just letting me know a little bit about what percentage of the time that you eat for fun, what of the time that you eat for function, and if you feel that you have any emotional eating. So I'm just going to send that one off and we'll let it's all private results that we get this way, but please jump on in and fill in those percentages. And in the meantime, if you've got that filled out, head over to the chat if you've got that access there, and if you've got any questions about the webinar that we just had, or if there's any questions that you had that we haven't covered yet that we can answer over for you. So the poll questions, once again, percentage of fun and function of eating, and do you feel that you class yourself as an emotional eater itself? So it's just quite interesting to see, how you're feeling about that. Here, so far we've got the fun side of eating. We've got around a 20-40% split there. I'm just looking at it. We've got here, and then we've got a higher percentage in the function. So that is great. And then emotional eating. Yes, we are all have a sense of emotional eating. I do have a higher section here of our responses coming back as yes and one no. So I appreciate that, that strength for that no person there, that mental resiliency that you have. And I'm just going to end the poll here now. I'm just going to jump over to our questions and see if there's anyone that has a question here. No questions. Must have been a really great webinar, Dr. Lee. That is great. So I'm actually going to try, while I've got you guys here, is actually pull up the polls and go over and actually see what most individuals have tried diet-wise. Now that we actually looked at the evidence base that Dr. Lee showed us on different eating styles and how they help the body itself. And it looks like we've got mixed balances around 33%. I'm just going to open up our other one, excuse me, as I go back and forth. It's this one here. So it looks like we've got, actually, Dr. Lee, no one said yes to plant-based diet. I'm very happy you had that slide.
Yeah.
So
it's difficult to do plant-based properly, to be honest. Even to sustain if you never ate plant-based before. I've been doing plant-based for the last couple of years, and you know, I dive in completely for several months just to learn everything. But it is hard because meat is you know, it's everywhere, ubiquitous, right, in terms of food choices. And so for myself, I use my work environment as a tool to aid in eating plant-based. So usually my lunches are plant-based, and then if I get the odd dinner plant-based, that's great. And so, but I'm about 50 to 60% plant-based typically.
And I can actually, Dr. Lee does eat his plant-based here. He's always got his chickpeas out, and I can hear his bowl tinging away. It's funny. Sometimes the first time I thought he was eating corn pops. They weren't corn pops. Now let's have a look. Great webinars. The recordings of the last webinar. Yes, we do have recordings of our previous webinars. If you are a current patient of ours, so today we have a mix of current patients, past patients, and community members out there. If you've registered for this webinar, this one will be on demand. If you've missed previous ones, you can actually hop onto our website and we'll have that available. If you don't see it there, please connect with us and we can email that over to you. We do have them on our YouTube channel available. So as the videos come available, we do a little editing and pop them over. So it will definitely be there for you. Any other questions? So it looked like the dieting styles, the higher ones were the ketogenic and the low carbohydrate. And I think that also comes with the popularity and the theme that goes along in, the magazine, social media, all these little things that are going. So there we go. So if there's no other questions, we're going to wrap this one up. We'll see you guys next month in our next webinar. It will be the last Wednesday of the month. And once again, Dr. Lee, it is going to be exercise with, what was it called again?
Without movement.
Without movement. So that's quite an interesting topic. And that's something that we're going to be teaching within our classes here as well, within our program at HAL Clinics. So thank you very much for all those that joined. And thank you for those that are watching the recording afterwards. And we will see you all later. Thank you very much.